Picture this. You wake up in the royal palace of Alexandria. The year is 51 BC, and you're witnessing something that would make your blood run cold if you truly understood what was happening. The most powerful woman in the ancient world, Cleopatra VII, is preparing for her wedding ceremony. The silk curtains flutter in the Mediterranean breeze as servants arrange golden ornaments and precious stones. The air is thick with incense and anticipation. But here's what would shock you to your core. The man waiting at the altar isn't some foreign prince or Roman general seeking an alliance. It's her own brother, Ptolemy XIII, barely 14 years old. You're watching the continuation of a tradition so twisted, so systematically destructive, that it would eventually consume one of history's greatest dynasties from within. For over 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic pharaohs had been marrying their siblings, their children, their nieces and nephews, in an endless cycle of genetic catastrophe disguised as political strategy. What started as a calculated attempt to preserve power had become a curse that would ultimately destroy everything they sought to protect. This isn't just another story about ancient royal marriages. This is the horrifying chronicle of how a single family's obsession with bloodline purity created a genetic nightmare that lasted for 13 generations. The descendants of Alexander the Great's most trusted general had built an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean, accumulated wealth beyond imagination, and commanded the loyalty of millions. Yet they couldn't escape the biological consequences of their own twisted family tree. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The story begins not with the Ptolemies themselves, but with the man who would unknowingly set the stage for 3 centuries of genetic disaster. When Alexander the Great died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BC, his vast empire immediately began tearing itself apart. His generals, known as the Diadochi, carved up the conquered territories like vultures fighting over a carcass. Among these ambitious men was Ptolemy, son of Lagus, one of Alexander's closest friends and most trusted commanders. Ptolemy was brilliant, ruthless, and possessed of a strategic mind that had helped conquer the known world. When the other generals squabbled over the more obvious prizes like Macedonia or Persia, Ptolemy made what seemed like a modest choice: Egypt. But this wasn't modesty, it was genius. Egypt was the richest, most stable, and most defensible territory in Alexander's former empire. It had natural borders, established trade routes, and a population that had been ruled by foreign pharaohs for centuries. What Ptolemy couldn't have foreseen was how his decision to adopt Egyptian royal customs would doom his bloodline. The pharaohs of Egypt had practiced brother-sister marriage for over 1,000 years before Ptolemy arrived. It was deeply embedded in their religious and political traditions, justified by the belief that pharaohs were living gods whose divine blood must not be diluted by mixing with mortals. When Ptolemy established his dynasty, he initially followed Greek customs, marrying outside his immediate family to forge political alliances. But power has a way of corrupting even the most rational minds. As the Ptolemaic dynasty consolidated control over Egypt, they began to see the advantages of the pharaonic marriage system. Marrying within the family eliminated the need to share power with foreign royal houses. It prevented rival dynasties from gaining influence through marriage alliances. Most importantly, it allowed them to present themselves as legitimate pharaohs to their Egyptian subjects, while maintaining their Greek identity to their Macedonian supporters. The first generation of Ptolemies practiced relatively conventional marriages. Ptolemy I married several women for political reasons, including Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman, and later Berenice I, who became his most important wife. Their children grew up in a cosmopolitan court where Greek, Egyptian, and Persian influences mingled. The future seemed bright for this new dynasty that combined Macedonian military prowess with Egyptian wealth and stability. But it was Ptolemy II who made the fateful decision that would echo through the centuries. In a move that shocked even the Greek world, he married his full sister, Arsinoe II. This wasn't just breaking Greek taboos, it was embracing a practice that most Greeks considered barbaric and immoral. The marriage was justified as a political necessity. Arsinoe was a formidable woman who had been married to Lysimachus, another of Alexander's successors, and her experience and connections made her a valuable ally. But the precedent had been set. What makes this decision so tragic is that Ptolemy II wasn't ignorant of the risks. The Greeks had observed Egyptian royal families for generations and had noticed the physical and mental deterioration that seemed to plague pharaonic bloodlines. Greek physicians and philosophers had written extensively about the importance of genetic diversity, though they didn't understand the science behind their observations. Yet political expediency trumped biological wisdom, and the pattern was established. The immediate consequences seemed minimal. Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II ruled successfully together, expanding Egypt's influence and building magnificent monuments. Their court became a center of learning and culture that rivaled Athens in its golden age. The famous Library of Alexandria reached its peak during their reign, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. On the surface, the sibling marriage appeared to be a triumph, but beneath the glittering facade, genetic damage was already accumulating. While Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II themselves seemed relatively healthy, their family tree was beginning to show the twisted patterns that would characterize the dynasty. Marriages between uncles and nieces, between cousins, and between half-siblings became routine. Each generation saw the gene pool grow smaller and more concentrated. The third generation of Ptolemies faced the first obvious signs of genetic deterioration. Ptolemy III, though still relatively healthy, showed the beginning of physical characteristics that would become increasingly pronounced in later generations. Contemporary accounts describe him as having an unusually large head and protruding eyes, traits that would become hallmarks of Ptolemaic inbreeding. His marriage to Berenice II, his cousin, continued the pattern of close family marriages. More disturbing were the behavioral changes that began appearing in the Ptolemaic court. The dynasty had always been characterized by political ruthlessness, but now that ruthlessness was taking on increasingly paranoid and irrational dimensions. Family members began murdering each other with shocking frequency, not just for political advantage, but seemingly out of paranoid delusions and uncontrolled rage. Ptolemy IV represents a turning point in the dynasty's decline. His marriage to his sister Arsinoe III produced the kind of horror story that would become typical of later Ptolemaic generations. Contemporary historians describe Ptolemy IV as physically weak, mentally unstable, and given to fits of violence that terrified even his closest advisors. His sister wife was reportedly beautiful, but showed signs of the learning difficulties and emotional instability that were becoming common in the royal family. The couple's attempts to produce an heir became a source of court intrigue and public speculation. Arsinoe III suffered multiple miscarriages, each one weakening her physically and psychologically. When she finally gave birth to a son, Ptolemy V, the child showed obvious signs of developmental problems from birth. He was slow to walk, slow to speak, and displayed the kind of behavioral issues that modern medicine would recognize as symptoms of genetic disorders. But the most telling sign of the dynasty's deterioration wasn't physical. It was psychological. The Ptolemaic court became increasingly isolated from reality. Surrounded by flattering courtiers who dared not speak truth to power, the pharaohs began to believe their own propaganda about divine blood and supernatural abilities. They lost touch with the practical realities of governing an empire, becoming obsessed with ritual and ceremony while their kingdom slowly crumbled around them. The palace itself became a reflection of this growing dysfunction. What had once been a cosmopolitan center of learning and culture gradually transformed into a bizarre theater of genetic horror. Court physicians developed elaborate theories to explain the increasing frequency of stillbirths, infant deaths, and developmental disorders among the royal family. They blamed curses, divine displeasure, and foreign poisoning, rather than acknowledging the obvious truth that everyone could see but no one dared speak. The religious implications of these marriages added another layer of psychological damage to the royal family. Egyptian theology held that pharaohs were literal gods, and that their divine nature was preserved through pure bloodlines. When Ptolemaic children were born with obvious genetic defects, it created a theological crisis that shook the foundations of royal legitimacy. How could gods produce imperfect offspring? The answer, crafted by court theologians, was that the defects were tests of faith or signs of special divine favor. This religious rationalization created a feedback loop that made the situation even worse. Instead of recognizing their genetic problems as reasons to change their marriage practices, the Ptolemies interpreted them as evidence that they needed to become even more pure, even more isolated from the outside world. Each generation retreated further into the fantasy of divine bloodlines, while the reality of genetic deterioration became impossible to ignore. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Egypt had been the wealthiest territory in the ancient world, but maintaining an increasingly dysfunctional royal court required enormous resources. The palace employed armies of physicians, astrologers, and religious specialists whose primary job was managing the consequences of royal inbreeding. Vast sums were spent on medical treatments, religious ceremonies, and elaborate attempts to hide the royal family's growing disabilities from public view. Meanwhile, the actual business of governing Egypt suffered from royal neglect and incompetence. Trade relationships with other Mediterranean powers became strained, as foreign diplomats struggled to negotiate with pharaohs who were increasingly detached from reality. Military campaigns were poorly planned and executed by rulers who combined grandiose ambitions with severely limited capabilities. The pattern established by these early generations would only intensify as the dynasty continued. What started as a calculated political strategy had become a genetic trap from which the Ptolemies could not escape. Each generation faced the same impossible choice: marry outside the family and risk losing legitimacy, or marry within the family and risk producing children even more damaged than themselves. The tragedy is that they had examples of successful royal dynasties that practiced more moderate marriage policies. The Seleucid Empire, founded by another of Alexander's generals, initially prospered by forging marriage alliances with local noble families. The Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia maintained its power through strategic marriages that brought fresh bloodlines while preserving political control. But the Ptolemies, trapped by their own success and their adoption of Egyptian customs, couldn't break free from the cycle they had created. As we'll see in the next part of our story, the genetic and psychological damage would only accelerate as the dynasty entered its middle period. The children and grandchildren of these early Ptolemies would face even more severe consequences of their ancestors' choices, leading to some of the most disturbing episodes in royal history. The seeds of destruction planted by Ptolemy II's marriage to his sister would grow into a forest of horror that would consume everything the dynasty had built. The children born from these twisted unions began displaying symptoms that court physicians struggled to explain or treat. By the time of Ptolemy V, the genetic damage had become so severe that the young pharaoh required constant medical supervision just to function in his daily duties. Palace records, discovered centuries later in the ruins of Alexandria, paint a disturbing picture of a royal household that had become more hospital than seat of power. Ptolemy V suffered from what ancient physicians called the divine trembling, violent seizures that would strike without warning, leaving him unconscious and convulsing on marble floors while terrified servants scrambled to prevent him from injuring himself. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand. forcing court interpreters to translate his words for foreign ambassadors who arrived expecting to negotiate with the ruler of the ancient world's greatest kingdom. But perhaps most tragic was his complete inability to form meaningful relationships with other human beings. The isolation imposed by his royal status, combined with the neurological damage caused by generations of inbreeding, created a young man who existed in a bubble of profound loneliness. He would spend hours talking to statues and portraits, conducting elaborate conversations with marble representations of his ancestors, as if they could respond to his desperate pleas for guidance and companionship. His marriage to Cleopatra IV, not the famous Cleopatra but her ancestor, represented a brief attempt by palace advisors to introduce fresh blood into the dynasty. Cleopatra I was a Seleucid princess, daughter of Antiochus III, and her arrival in Alexandria brought hope that the genetic curse might finally be broken. She was intelligent, healthy, and possessed the political acumen that had made the Seleucid dynasty one of the most successful Hellenistic kingdoms. For a moment, it seemed as though this strategy might work. The marriage produced 3 children who appeared healthier than their father, showing fewer obvious signs of genetic damage. Palace physicians proclaimed it a miracle, evidence that the gods had blessed the union between Egyptian divinity and foreign nobility. But this hope would prove tragically short-lived. Cleopatra I died young, leaving her children in the care of a court system that was structurally incapable of breaking free from its destructive patterns. Without her moderating influence, the palace reverted to its established practices of sibling marriage. Her children, Ptolemy VI, Ptolemy VIII, and Cleopatra II, would become the protagonists in one of the most disturbing chapters of the dynasty's history. The 6th generation of Ptolemies turned brother-sister marriage into something approaching performance art in its calculated perversity. Ptolemy VI married his sister Cleopatra II in a ceremony that contemporary observers described as more funeral than wedding. Both siblings understood what they were doing to themselves and their future children, but the political machinery of the dynasty had become so dependent on familial isolation that alternatives seemed impossible. Cleopatra II was reportedly beautiful by the standards of her time, but palace physicians noted troubling signs even before her marriage. She suffered from what they called moon madness, periods of deep depression and erratic behavior that coincided with lunar cycles. Modern medical understanding suggests she may have suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition that would have been exacerbated by the stress of royal duties and the knowledge of her genetic destiny. The marriage between Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II produced children who represented new depths of genetic catastrophe. Their son, who would become Ptolemy VII, lived only 17 years and died under mysterious circumstances that court records carefully avoided describing in detail. Contemporary accounts suggest he suffered from multiple physical deformities and severe intellectual disabilities that made him completely unsuitable for royal duties. But the true horror of this generation wasn't revealed until Cleopatra II made a decision that shocked even the jaded courtiers of Alexandria. After her brother-husband's death, she married her other brother, Ptolemy VIII, in what amounted to a public acknowledgement that the dynasty had completely abandoned any pretense of normal human relationships. Ptolemy VIII, known to history as Ptolemy Physcon, due to his grotesquely obese appearance, represented everything wrong with royal inbreeding, concentrated in a single individual. Contemporary historians describe him as physically repulsive, mentally unstable, and possessed of appetites so depraved that they disturbed even the corrupt court of Alexandria. His body was so misshapen that he required specially constructed furniture and clothing, and his behavioral problems included violent rages, paranoid delusions, and sexual appetites that horrified even his own guards. The marriage between Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII became a nightmare that played out in public view. Palace servants reported screaming matches that could be heard throughout the royal quarter, violent confrontations that left both siblings bloodied and traumatized, and periods of mutual hatred so intense that they would refuse to be in the same room for months at a time. Yet they continued attempting to produce children, driven by the dynastic imperative that had consumed their family for over 2 centuries. Each pregnancy became a source of court anxiety, as physicians and astrologers tried to predict whether the child would survive birth, let alone prove capable of ruling an empire. Miscarriages became so common that they were barely recorded in official documents, treated as routine disappointments rather than the tragedies they represented. When children did survive to birth, they often displayed combinations of genetic defects that defied the medical understanding of the ancient world. Palace records describe infants born with limbs that didn't develop properly, children who couldn't learn to speak or walk, and young people whose mental capabilities never progressed beyond those of small children, despite their royal education and privileges. The psychological impact on the surviving members of the royal family was devastating in ways that went far beyond the physical symptoms of inbreeding. Living in a world where your siblings were also your spouses, where your children were likely to be born damaged, and where your own genetic heritage was a source of shame rather than pride, created forms of mental anguish that no amount of wealth or power could alleviate. Cleopatra II began showing signs of what palace physicians called divine melancholy, a condition that modern psychology would recognize as severe clinical depression with psychotic features. She would spend days in darkened chambers, refusing food and speaking only to voices that no one else could hear. Court astrologers and religious specialists were called in to perform elaborate rituals designed to lift the curse they believed had fallen upon the royal house. But the most disturbing aspect of this generation wasn't the genetic damage itself. It was how the dynasty had learned to normalize and even celebrate its own destruction. Court poets composed elaborate verses praising the purity of royal blood, while philosophers developed complex theories explaining why genetic defects were actually signs of divine favor. The palace became an echo chamber where reality was systematically distorted to maintain the fiction that royal inbreeding was not only acceptable but necessary for the preservation of Egyptian civilization. This psychological denial reached its peak during the joint reign of Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII, when both brothers simultaneously claimed the throne and married the same sister. The resulting civil war tore Egypt apart, but the truly horrifying aspect wasn't the political chaos. It was the fact that all three siblings continued attempting to produce children, even as their kingdom collapsed around them. The children born during this period of civil war grew up in a world where violence, incest, and genetic horror were so normalized that they seemed natural. These royal children learned to navigate palace intrigue before they could properly walk, developed survival strategies based on manipulating relatives who were also potential spouses, and absorbed lessons about power that would have horrified their Macedonian ancestors. Palace records from this period reveal a court system that had evolved specifically to manage the consequences of royal inbreeding. Entire departments were dedicated to hiding royal disabilities from public view, crafting official portraits that minimized genetic defects, and training body doubles who could appear at public ceremonies when the actual pharaohs were too damaged to be seen in public. The economic cost of maintaining this elaborate charade was staggering. Egypt's treasury, once the envy of the ancient world, was being drained by the constant need to manage royal dysfunction. Medical treatments, religious ceremonies, court cover-ups, and civil wars, fought between genetically damaged siblings, consumed resources that might have been used to maintain Egypt's position as a Mediterranean superpower. Meanwhile, Rome was watching. Roman senators and generals observed the Ptolemaic chaos with a mixture of fascination and calculation, recognizing that Egypt's internal weakness represented an opportunity for expansion. The genetic catastrophe that the Ptolemies had inflicted upon themselves was creating a power vacuum that Rome was perfectly positioned to fill. The most tragic irony of this period is that the Ptolemies still possessed enormous potential wealth and strategic advantages. Egypt remained the richest territory in the Mediterranean. Its agricultural productivity was unmatched, and its geographic position made it crucial for trade between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Under competent leadership, the kingdom could have remained a major power for centuries longer. Instead, the dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity had created rulers who were increasingly incapable of effective governance. The gap between Egypt's potential and its actual performance grew wider with each generation, as genetic damage made rational decision-making increasingly difficult for the royal family. The seventh generation of Ptolemies would face even more severe consequences of their ancestors' choices, leading to episodes of violence and dysfunction that would make the previous generation's problems seem mild by comparison. The seeds of destruction planted centuries earlier were about to bear their most bitter fruit, as the dynasty entered its final descent into genetic and political chaos. The seventh generation of Ptolemies witnessed something that would have been unimaginable to their Macedonian ancestors: the complete breakdown of basic human relationships within the royal family. By the time Ptolemy I and Ptolemy X came to power, the genetic damage had progressed beyond physical deformities and mental disabilities to something far more sinister: the complete inability to form normal emotional bonds with other human beings. Ptolemy IX, known as Lethyros, displayed a combination of traits that terrified even the hardened courtiers of Alexandria. Contemporary accounts describe him as possessing an almost supernatural ability to manipulate and deceive, combined with a complete lack of empathy for human suffering. He could order mass executions while eating his breakfast, discuss the torture of political prisoners as casually as the weather, and plan the murder of family members with the same detached interest he might show in organizing a hunting expedition. But what made Ptolemy IX truly disturbing wasn't his cruelty. Egyptian pharaohs had always been capable of violence when it served their purposes. It was his complete disconnection from normal human emotion. Palace servants reported that he never showed anger, fear, joy, or sadness in the way that normal people did. Instead, he seemed to observe his own life from a distance, as if he were watching a play in which he happened to be the leading character. His relationship with his sister wife, Cleopatra IV, exemplified this emotional void. Their marriage wasn't characterized by the passionate hatred that had marked previous generations, but by something far more chilling: complete indifference. They lived in the same palace, shared the same bed, and attempted to produce children together. But contemporary observers noted that they interacted with each other like strangers conducting a business transaction. Cleopatra IV, meanwhile, had developed her own disturbing coping mechanisms. Palace physicians noted that she had begun talking to herself constantly, conducting elaborate conversations with invisible companions who seemed more real to her than the actual people around her. She would spend hours arranging and rearranging objects in her chambers according to patterns that made sense only to her, creating complex geometric designs that she claimed were messages from the gods. The couple's attempts at procreation became a source of morbid fascination for the court. Each pregnancy was monitored by teams of physicians, astrologers, and religious specialists who tried to predict the outcome through increasingly elaborate rituals and ceremonies. When children were born alive, which happened rarely, they were immediately examined for signs of the genetic defects that had become the dynasty's trademark. One child, whose name was carefully erased from all official records, reportedly survived for 3 years despite being born with such severe physical deformities that court physicians initially declared survival impossible. Palace servants whispered that the child couldn't walk, speak, or even hold its head upright. Yet Ptolemy IX insisted on having it brought to public ceremonies where it would be displayed as proof of the dynasty's divine favor. The psychological impact of caring for such children created new forms of mental illness within the royal household. Nurses and servants who worked in the royal nurseries began showing symptoms of what palace physicians called divine madness, a condition characterized by nightmares, paranoid delusions, and an obsessive fear of producing children themselves. Many requested transfers to other parts of the palace, while others simply disappeared one night, presumably unable to cope with the horror of their daily duties. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this generation was how they had learned to use their genetic damage as a political weapon. Ptolemy IX discovered that his obviously impaired mental state actually made him more effective in certain types of negotiations. Foreign diplomats, uncertain whether his strange behavior was calculated or genuine, often found themselves agreeing to terms they wouldn't have accepted from a obviously competent ruler. This weaponization of dysfunction reached its peak during a diplomatic meeting with Roman senators who had come to negotiate tribute payments. Ptolemy IX spent the entire meeting speaking to empty chairs as if they were occupied by invisible advisors, occasionally pausing to listen to responses that only he could hear. The Romans, unsure whether they were witnessing divine inspiration or complete madness, agreed to more favorable terms than they had originally planned, simply to escape the unsettling experience. Meanwhile, Ptolemy X was developing his own approach to managing the family's genetic heritage. Rather than attempting to hide his disabilities, he embraced them as evidence of his divine nature. He claimed that his physical deformities, which contemporary accounts describe as including a severely hunched back, arms of different lengths, and a head that was noticeably too large for his body, were signs that he contained more divine essence than normal humans could accommodate. This religious interpretation of genetic damage became central to late Ptolemaic ideology. Court theologians developed elaborate theories explaining how each physical defect corresponded to a specific divine attribute. Seizures were reinterpreted as moments of prophetic vision, speech impediments became evidence of communication with celestial beings, and obvious intellectual disabilities were transformed into signs of otherworldly wisdom. The palace itself was redesigned to accommodate these new interpretations of royal disability. Chambers were constructed with special acoustics that made incomprehensible speech sound more mysterious and divine. Lighting was arranged to cast shadows that minimized visible deformities while creating an atmosphere of supernatural presence. Even the royal furniture was crafted to support bodies that could no longer function normally while maintaining the appearance of divine majesty. But the most innovative adaptation was the development of what court records call divine interpreters, specially trained servants whose job was to translate the increasingly incoherent utterances of the royal family into coherent policy decisions. These interpreters became some of the most powerful people in the kingdom, as they essentially controlled all communication between the pharaohs and their subjects. The selection and training of divine interpreters became a crucial part of palace administration. Candidates were chosen not for their intelligence or political acumen, but for their ability to construct plausible meanings from random sounds and gestures. They learned to read facial expressions, body language, and even involuntary movements as if they were a complex language requiring specialized translation. This system created a bizarre form of government, where actual policy decisions were made by servants pretending to interpret the divine will of rulers who were increasingly incapable of rational thought. Laws were passed, taxes were collected, and military campaigns were planned based on the supposed translations of pharaohs who might be having seizures, speaking to hallucinations, or simply making random noises. The economic consequences of this system were predictably catastrophic. Egypt's administrative efficiency, once the wonder of the ancient world, collapsed as bureaucrats struggled to implement policies that changed daily based on new, divine revelations. Trade relationships suffered as foreign merchants found it impossible to negotiate stable agreements with representatives who claimed their authority came from interpreting the involuntary twitches of genetically damaged rulers. Yet somehow the system persisted. The palace had become so isolated from reality that even the most obvious failures were reinterpreted as successes. When tax collection declined, it was explained as divine mercy toward the Egyptian people. When foreign territories were lost, it was presented as the gods, calling their chosen pharaohs to focus on spiritual rather than worldly concerns. The religious establishment played a crucial role in maintaining these fictions. Priests throughout Egypt were required to participate in elaborate ceremonies celebrating the divine nature of royal disabilities. Temples commissioned artworks depicting the pharaoh's genetic defects as sacred symbols, while religious festivals were organized around themes of divine imperfection being superior to human wholeness. But beneath this elaborate theological framework, the reality of genetic deterioration continued its relentless progression. The eighth generation of Ptolemies would face even more severe challenges as the accumulated damage of centuries of inbreeding reached new levels of severity. Children were being born who couldn't survive outside the artificial environment of the palace, while those who did survive showed combinations of disabilities that defied all attempts at religious rationalization. Palace physicians began keeping secret records of the true extent of royal genetic damage, documenting symptoms and conditions that couldn't be publicly acknowledged without destroying the entire ideological foundation of Ptolemaic rule. These hidden medical archives, discovered centuries later by archaeologists, reveal the growing desperation of court doctors who understood the biological reality of what was happening, but were powerless to change the political and religious systems that perpetuated it. The most disturbing entries in these secret medical records describe attempts to selectively breed healthier royal children by introducing genetic material from outside the immediate family. Palace physicians experimented with various forms of artificial insemination, using servants and slaves as surrogate genetic donors while maintaining the fiction that all royal children were products of pure pharaonic bloodlines. These experiments, conducted in hidden chambers beneath the palace, represented a desperate attempt to preserve the dynasty while maintaining its ideological foundations. But they also revealed the complete moral bankruptcy of a system that was willing to use human beings as experimental animals in service of maintaining political power. The children produced by these secret breeding programs showed mixed results. Some appeared healthier than their officially acknowledged siblings, but they also created new problems for palace administration. How could children with obviously superior capabilities be prevented from challenging the succession rights of their more severely impaired relatives? How could the existence of healthier royal offspring be hidden from a court system that monitored every aspect of palace life? The solutions developed by palace administrators were as creative as they were morally reprehensible. Healthy royal children were often sent away from Alexandria under various pretexts, supposedly to receive special education or religious training in distant temples. In reality, many were probably killed to prevent them from complicating succession disputes, while others were raised in secret locations where they could never threaten the established order. Meanwhile, the official royal family continued its descent into genetic chaos. Palace records from this period describe scenes that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Pharaohs who couldn't recognize their own family members, children who never learned to control basic bodily functions, and royal ceremonies where the central figures had to be physically supported by servants just to remain upright. Yet the system persisted, held together by a combination of religious ideology, political inertia, and the simple fact that no one within the palace walls possessed the authority or courage to acknowledge that the entire foundation of Ptolemaic rule had become a grotesque fiction. The courtiers who might have initiated reforms were themselves products of the same isolated, distorted environment that had created the royal family's problems. As we approach the final generations of the dynasty, including the famous Cleopatra VII whose story opened our narrative, we'll see how these accumulated genetic and psychological damages would finally collide with the rising power of Rome. The woman who would become history's most famous queen was herself a product of this centuries-long experiment in dynastic inbreeding, carrying within her DNA the accumulated weight of her ancestors' choices. But Cleopatra VII's story represents more than just the culmination of genetic deterioration. It also reveals how even the most damaged individuals can sometimes transcend their circumstances through sheer force of will and intelligence. Her ability to function as an effective ruler despite her genetic heritage would become one of history's most remarkable examples of human resilience, triumphing over biological destiny. The palace that had witnessed so much horror and dysfunction would soon become the stage for the dynasty's final act, as the last pharaoh of Egypt faced the impossible task of preserving a kingdom that had been systematically weakened by 3 centuries of genetic self-destruction. The seeds planted by Ptolemy II's decision to marry his sister were finally ready to bear their ultimate fruit in the person of a queen who would become legend precisely because she managed to rise above the toxic legacy of her bloodline. The final generations of the Ptolemaic dynasty witnessed something that would have been unthinkable to their Macedonian ancestors: the complete convergence of genetic catastrophe with political necessity. By the time we reach Cleopatra VII, the woman whose story opened our journey, the accumulated damage of 13 generations had created a ruler who was simultaneously the dynasty's greatest triumph and its most tragic victim. Cleopatra VII was born into a world where the very air seemed poisoned by centuries of genetic mistakes. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known mockingly as Auletes or the flute player, embodied everything wrong with late Ptolemaic rule. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically weak, mentally unstable, and so obviously impaired that Roman senators openly discussed whether Egypt needed a competent ruler to prevent complete collapse. Yet within this wreckage of human genetics, something extraordinary had occurred. Cleopatra VII possessed an intelligence that seemed to burn brighter precisely because it existed within such a damaged vessel. Palace tutors noted that she learned languages with supernatural speed, mastering not just Greek and Egyptian, but Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, and several other tongues before her 15th birthday. Her mind absorbed information like a sponge, as if her consciousness understood that it inhabited a body destined for early failure and was racing to accomplish everything possible before genetic destiny claimed its due. But this intellectual brilliance came at a terrible price. Palace physicians documented symptoms that revealed the true cost of her genetic heritage. She suffered from severe headaches that would leave her unconscious for days, seizures that required constant medical supervision, and episodes of what they called divine fury, during which she would speak in languages no one recognized while her body convulsed uncontrollably. Her marriage to her brother Ptolemy XIII represented the dynasty's final embrace of its destructive traditions. The wedding ceremony we witnessed at the beginning of our story was a masterpiece of theatrical deception, designed to hide the biological reality of what was occurring. Ptolemy XIII was barely 14, physically underdeveloped, and showed obvious signs of the intellectual disabilities that had plagued recent generations. Palace records describe him as having difficulty speaking coherently, requiring assistance with basic tasks, and displaying the kind of behavioral problems that made effective rule impossible. The relationship between these two damaged siblings was unlike anything in the dynasty's previous history. Where earlier generations had been characterized by passionate hatred or cold indifference, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII developed a dynamic that was almost symbiotic in its dysfunction. She provided the intelligence and political acumen necessary for governance, while he served as the male figurehead required by Egyptian religious tradition. But this arrangement couldn't last. Cleopatra's superior capabilities made her brother's limitations increasingly obvious to the court, creating tensions that threatened to tear the already fragile dynasty apart. Palace servants reported violent arguments between the siblings, with Cleopatra berating Ptolemy XIII for his failures while he responded with the kind of incoherent rage that had become typical of late Ptolemaic males. The breaking point came when Cleopatra made a decision that revealed both her desperation and her genius. Rather than accepting the slow decline that had characterized her predecessors, she chose to gamble everything on an alliance with Rome. This wasn't just political calculation, it was biological necessity. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in the palace, that the Ptolemaic bloodline had reached the end of its genetic viability. Her relationship with Julius Caesar represents one of history's most successful attempts to overcome genetic destiny through sheer force of personality. Caesar, the most powerful man in the Roman world, was initially skeptical of allying with a queen whose bloodline was notorious for instability. But Cleopatra's intelligence, combined with her desperate need to preserve her kingdom, created a political partnership that temporarily reversed Egypt's decline. The children she bore to Caesar and later to Mark Antony were conscious attempts to introduce fresh genetic material into the Ptolemaic line. Palace physicians carefully monitored these pregnancies, hoping that Roman blood might dilute the accumulated toxins of Egyptian royal inbreeding. When Caesarion was born healthy and intellectually normal, it seemed as though Cleopatra had finally broken the curse that had plagued her family for centuries. But even these successes couldn't completely overcome the biological damage she had inherited. Contemporary accounts describe her physical deterioration accelerating rapidly after each pregnancy, as if the effort of producing healthy children was consuming whatever genetic resilience remained in her system. Palace servants noted that she aged years in months, developing the tremors and speech difficulties that had characterized her ancestors while struggling to maintain the public facade of divine pharaonic power. Her famous beauty, celebrated in countless works of art and literature, was itself a product of careful palace management designed to hide genetic reality. Court artists learned to minimize her physical flaws while emphasizing her intelligence and charisma. The woman who seduced the two most powerful men in Rome was fighting a constant battle against the biological legacy of 13 generations of inbreeding. The final act of Cleopatra's life reveals both the tragedy and the heroism of her situation. When Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, she faced a choice that perfectly encapsulated the Ptolemaic dilemma. She could surrender and face the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a conquered barbarian, or she could choose death on her own terms, preserving at least some dignity for herself and her bloodline. Her suicide by ace-p bite was more than just a dramatic gesture. It was the final act of a dynasty that had been slowly poisoning itself for 3 centuries. The woman who died in that palace chamber was simultaneously the last pharaoh of Egypt and the ultimate victim of her ancestors' genetic experiments. Her death marked the end not just of Ptolemaic rule, but of the entire tradition of pharaonic monarchy that had governed Egypt for over 3,000 years. The palace that had witnessed so much horror fell silent forever. Roman administrators moved through its corridors, cataloging treasures and transforming chambers that had housed genetic nightmares into mundane offices for imperial bureaucrats. The elaborate systems designed to manage royal dysfunction were dismantled, the divine interpreters dismissed, and the medical archives that documented centuries of genetic deterioration were sealed away or destroyed. But the true legacy of the Ptolemaic experiment extends far beyond ancient Egypt. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of political systems that prioritize ideological purity over biological reality. The same forces that drove the Ptolemies to marry their siblings, the desire to preserve power, maintain cultural identity, and resist outside influence, continue to shape human societies today. Modern genetics has given us the scientific understanding that the ancient world lacked, but the fundamental tension between political necessity and biological wisdom remains unchanged. The Ptolemies' 3-century experiment in dynastic inbreeding stands as history's most comprehensive demonstration of what happens when ideology triumphs over biology, when short-term political advantages are pursued at the cost of long-term genetic viability. Their story reminds us that power without wisdom is ultimately self-destructive, that isolation breeds weakness rather than strength, and that the most carefully constructed political systems can be undone by the simple biological reality that genetic diversity is essential for human survival. The palace walls that once echoed with the voices of gods and goddesses now stand silent, their stones bearing witness to the ultimate futility of trying to escape the fundamental laws of nature through political manipulation. In the end, the descendants of Alexander the Great's most trusted general had created something unprecedented in human history, a genetic experiment conducted on an imperial scale with an entire kingdom serving as the laboratory and 13 generations of rulers as the test subjects. The results of that experiment speak for themselves in the ruins of Alexandria, in the medical records hidden in ancient archives, and in the DNA that modern science can now analyze to reveal the true cost of the Ptolemaic obsession with bloodline purity. The boy and girl we watched preparing for their wedding ceremony at the beginning of our story were not just individuals facing personal tragedy. They were the final products of humanity's most sustained attempt to defy the biological laws that govern all living things. Their fate and the fate of their kingdom stands as eternal testimony to the simple truth that power, wealth, and divine pretensions cannot overcome the fundamental requirement that life must diversify to survive. The Ptolemaic pharaohs thought they were preserving their bloodline's purity, but they were actually documenting its destruction, generation by generation, marriage by marriage, child by child, until nothing remained but silence and the whisper of Mediterranean wind through empty palace halls where gods once walked and genetic nightmares once ruled the ancient world.